I actually gotta restart thing in a moment. About to read the chapter on self-defense. I don't know how loud that is. If it's but oh, I have a very luminous head. Anyway. So it's go to page. Property and opening on the left. 130 maybe? No, it's much too chapter 150. Okay, so yeah, we did this chapter for sure. But self-defense time. Also, haven't been here in a couple whiles. Slightly different in how it's offset. It wiggles around between takes. My bad. Oh well. So I'm gonna track down some better stuff to listen. Get some royalty free. Let's just go to a random. There. That's good. Not exactly my vibe, but I'm kind of tired of the video game. If every man has the absolute right to his justly held property, it then follows that he has the right to keep that property, defend it by violence against invasion. Absolute pacifists also assert their belief in property rights, such as Mr. Robert Lefebvre, are caught in an inescapable. For if a man owns property, it is denied the right to defend it against attack. Declare that a very important aspect of that ownership being denied to him. To say that someone has the absolute right to a certain property but lacks the right to defend it against attack or invasion, so to say that he does not have the right to that property. No, I think we all agree that pacifism is a bit dumb here. Furthermore, if every man has the right to defend his person and property against attack, he must also have the right to hire or accept the aid of other people in such defense. may employ or accept defenders, just as he may employ or accept the volunteer services of gardeners. How extensive is a man's right of self-defense of person and property? The basic answer must be up to the point at which he begins to infringe on the property rights of someone. For in that case, his defense would in itself constitute a criminal invasion of just property of some other man. The latter could properly defend himself against. It follows that defensive violence may only be used against an actual or directly threatened invasion of a person's property, and may not be used against any non-violent harm that may befall a person's property value. I think this is something a lot of people get wrong. Well, doesn't matter if they're affecting these sort of abstract qualities. It has to be the property itself. Thus, suppose that A, B, etc. decide for whatever reason to boycott the sales of goods from Smith's factory or store. They picket, distribute leaflets, and all in a non-invasive manner, calling on everyone to boycott Smith. Smith may lose considerable income, and they may well doing this for trivial or even immoral reasons, but the fact remains that organizing such a boycott is perfectly within their rights, and if Smith tried to use violence to break up such boycott activity, a criminal invader of their property. Defensive violence, therefore, must be confined to resisting invasive acts against person or property, but such invasion may include corollaries to actual physical aggression. Intimidation, or a direct threat of physical violence. Fraud involves the appropriation of someone else's property without his consent and is therefore implicit theft. Thus, suppose someone approaches you on the street, whips out a gun, and demands your wallet. He might not have molested you physically during this encounter, but he has extracted money from you on the basis of a direct, overt threat that he would shoot if you disobeyed his commands. Has used the threat of invasion to obtain your obedience, and this is equivalent to the invasion itself. It is important to insist, however, that the threat of aggression be palpable, immediate, and direct. In short, that it be embodied in the initiation of an overt act, any remote or indirect criterion, risk, or threat, simply an excuse for invasive action by the offender against the alleged threat. One of the major arguments, for example, for prohibition of alcohol in the 1920s was that imbibing of alcohol, likelihood of unspecified people committing various crimes, therefore prohibition was held to be a defensive act in defense of person and property. In fact, of course, it was brutally invasive of the rights of person and property, of the right to buy, sell, and use alcoholic beverages. In the same way, it could be held that A, failure to ingest vitamins, irritable, that B, the failure is therefore likely to incur crime, and that therefore C, everyone should be take the proper amount of vitamins. Once we bring in threats to person and property that are vague and future, i.e. are not overt and immediate, then all manner of tyranny becomes excusable. The only way to guard against such despotism is to keep the criterion of persuasion clear and immediate and or I'm gonna out of my wrong thing. Accept. Okay, that doesn't change the sound on your end, I don't think. Doesn't. I do that, and then up here, slightly. Is that a good volume? I'm not sure how to tell. I hate listening to my own voice. Look, I'm not gonna cheat. The only way to guard against such despotism is the criterion of perceived invasion clear and immediate and overt. Or, in the inevitable case of fuzzy or unclear action, must bend over backwards to require the threat of invasion to be direct and therefore to allow people to do whatever they may be. In short, the burden of proof that the aggression has really begun must be on the person who employs the defensive force, violence. Yeah. Fraud as implicit theft stems from the right of free contract, derived in turn from the rights of private property. Thus, suppose that Smith and Jones agree on a contractual exchange of property types. Smith will pay $1,000 in return for Jones's car. Smith appropriates the car and then refuses to turn over $1,000. Smith has in effect stolen the $1,000. Smith is an aggressor against $1,000 now properly belonging to Jones. Thus, failure to keep a contract of this type is tantamount to theft, and therefore to a physical appropriation of another's property. Fully as violent as trespass or simple burglary without armed assault. Fraudulent adulteration is equally implicit. If Smith pays $1,000 and receives from Jones not a specified make of car, but an older and poorer car, this too is implicit. Once again, someone's property has been appropriated without the other person's property being turned over to him as agreed. But we must not be led into the trap of holding that all contracts, whatever their nature, must be enforced, i.e., that violence may properly be used. The only reason the above contracts are enforceable is that breaking such contracts involves an implicit theft of property. Those contracts which do not involve implicit theft should not be enforced in a libertarian society. Suppose, for example, that A and B make an agreement, a contract, to get married in 6 months, or that A promises that in 6 months' time A will give B a certain sum of money. If A breaks these agreements, he may perhaps be morally reprehensible, but he has not implicitly stolen the other person's property, and therefore such a contract cannot be enforced. Use violence in order to force A to carry out such contracts would be just as much a criminal invasion of A's rights as it would be if Smith decided to use violence against men who would. Simple promises, therefore, are not properly enforceable contracts because breaking them does not involve invasion of property. Debt contracts are properly enforceable not because a promise is involved, but because the creditor's property is appropriated without his consent, i.e., stolen, if the debt is not paid. Thus, if Brown lends Green $1,000 this year in return for the delivery of $1,100 next year, and Green fails to pay the $1,100, proper conclusion is that Green has appropriated $1,100 of Smith's property. Green refuses to turn over, in effect, as stolen. This legal way of treating a debt, of holding that the creditor has a property, it should be applied to all debt contracts. Thus, it is not the business of law, properly the rules and instrumentalities by which person and property are violently defended, make people moral by use of violence. It is not the proper business of law to make people be truthful in their promises. It is the business of legal violence to defend persons and their property from violent attack, from molestation or appropriation of their property, without their consent. To say more, to say, for example, that mere promises are properly enforceable, is to make an unwarranted fetish of contracts while forgetting why some of them are enforceable in defense of just rights of property. Why is my brain fogging up? Violent defense must be confined to violent invasion, either actually, implicitly, or by direct and overt threat. But given this principle, how far does the right of violent defense? For one thing, it would clearly be grotesque and criminally invasive to shoot a man across the street because of an angry look to you end an invasion. The danger must be immediate and overt, might say clear and present. A criterion that properly applies not to restrictions on freedom of speech, never permits regard such freedom as a subset of rights of personal property, but to the right to take coercive action against a supposedly. Secondly, we may ask, must we go along with those libertarians who claim that a storekeeper has the right to kill a lad as punishment for snatching a piece of bubblegum, what we might call maximal position? By stealing the bubblegum, the urchin puts himself outside the law, demonstrates by his action that he does not respect the correct theory of property rights. Therefore, he loses all of his rights. The storekeeper is within his rights to kill the lad and return. I propose that this position suffers from a grotesque lack of proportion. By concentrating on the storekeeper's right to his bubblegum, it ignores a highly precious property right. Every man, including the urchin, right to self-ownership. What basis must we hold that a minuscule invasion of an lays one forfeit to the loss of one? I propose another fundamental rule regarding crime. The criminal or invader loses his own right to the extent that he has deprived another. A man deprives another man of some of his self-ownership or its extension into property. To that extent does he lose his own right. From this principle immediately derives the proportionality theory of punishment, best summed up in the old adage, let the punishment fit the crime. I was thinking eye for an eye. Eye for an eye is about proportionality of response. People think it's about revenge, but that's a bad read. We conclude that the shopkeeper's shooting of the erring lad went beyond this proportionate loss of rights, the wounding or killing the criminal. This going beyond is in itself an invasion of the property right in the own person of the bubblegum thief. In fact, the storekeeper has become a far greater criminal than, for he has killed or wounded, a far graver invasion of another's rights, original shoplifting. Should it be illegal, we may next inquire to cite a riot. Suppose that Green exhorts a crowd, go, burn, loot, kill, and the mob proceeds to do just that, with Green having nothing further to do with the criminal activity. Since every man is free to adopt or not adopt any course of action he wishes, we cannot say that in some way Green determined of the mob their criminal activity. We cannot make him, because of his exhortation, at all responsible for their crimes. Inciting to riot, therefore, is a pure exercise of a man's right to speak, without being thereby implicated in crime. On the other hand, it is obvious that if Green happened to be involved in a plan or conspiracy with others to commit crimes, and that then Green told them to proceed, he would then be just as implicated in the crimes as are the others. Also, if he were the mastermind who headed the criminal gang. This is a seemingly subtle distinction. In practice, clear-cut. There is a world of difference between the head of a criminal gang and a soapbox orator during a riot. The former is not, properly, to be charged simply with incitement. It should further be clear from our discussion of defense that every man has the absolute right to bear arms, whether for self-defense or any other licit purpose. The crime comes not from bearing arms, but from using them for purposes of threatened or actual. It is curious, by the way, that the laws have especially banned concealed weapons, when it is precisely the open and concealed weapon that might be used for intimidation. In every crime, in every invasion of rights, from the most negligible contract up to there are always two parties, sets of parties involved: the victim and the alleged criminal, defendant. The purpose of every judicial proceeding is to find as best we can who the criminal is or is not in a given case. Generally, the judicial rule seek the most widely accepted, finding out who the criminal is. But the libertarian has one overriding caveat on these procedures. No force may be used against non-criminals. Any physical force used against a non-criminal is an invasion of a person's rights, and is therefore itself criminal and impotent. Take, for example, police practice of beating and torturing suspects, or at least of tapping their wires. People who object to these practices are invariably accused by conservatives of coddling criminals. But the whole point is that we don't know if these are criminals or not. Until convicted, they must be proved not to be criminals and to enjoy the rights of the words of the famous phrase, "They are innocent until." The only exception would be a victim exerting self-defense on the spot against an aggressor, for he knows that the criminal is invading his home. Coddling criminals then becomes, in actuality, making sure that police do not criminally invade the rights of self-ownership of presumptive innocents whom they suspect of crime. In that case, the coddler and the restrainer of the police proves to be far more of a genuine defender of property rights than is the conservative. I may qualify this discussion in one important sense. Police may use such coercive methods provided that the suspect turns out to be guilty, and provided that the police are treated as themselves criminal if the suspect is not proven. Or, in that case, the rule of no force against non-criminals would still apply. Suppose, for example, that police beat and torture a suspected murderer to find information. Not to wring a confession, obviously a coerced confession could never be. If the suspect turns out to be guilty, police should be exonerated, for then they have only ladled out to the murderer a parcel of what he deserves in return. We shouldn't trust, I think there should be a penalty, but yeah, it should be maybe they should get fired, but they shouldn't be criminally. But if the suspect is not convicted, then that means that the police have beaten and tortured a man, and that they in turn must be put into the dock for criminal assault. In short, in all cases, police must be treated in precisely the same way as anyone else. In a libertarian world, every man has equal liberty, equal rights under the libertarian law. There can be no special immunity, special licenses for crime. That means that police in a libertarian society must take their chances. If they commit an act of invasion against someone, that someone had better turn out to deserve it, otherwise they are the criminals. As a corollary, police can never be allowed to commit an invasion that is worse than, or that is more than proportionate to, crime under investigation. Thus, the police can never be allowed to beat and torture someone charged with petty theft. The a beating is far more proportionate a violation of a man's rights theft, even if the man is indeed the thief. I mean, it should be clear that no man, in an attempt to exercise his right of self-defense, may coerce anyone else into defending him. That would mean that the defender himself would be a criminal invader of the rights of others. Thus, if A is aggressing against B may not use tell C to join in defending him. Then B would be just as much a aggressor against. This immediately rules out conscription for defense, for conscription enslaves a man him to fight on someone else's behalf. It also rules out such a deeply embedded part of our legal system as compulsory witnessing. No man should have the right to force anyone else to on any subject. The familiar prohibition against coerced self-incrimination is, but it should be extended to preserving the right not to incriminate anyone else, or indeed to say nothing at all. Freedom to speak is meaningless without the corollary freedom to remain silent. If no force may be used against one criminal, then the current system of compulsory jury duty must also be abolished. Just as conscription is a form of slavery, so too is compulsory jury duty. That's a fun sentence. I might post that on my Facebook. That's a good quote, though. Anyway, precisely. That's probably good. Big font for me. As I think. Precisely because being a juror is so important to service must not be filled by resentful. How can any society call itself libertarian rest on a foundation of jury slavery? In the current system, the courts enslave jurors because they pay a daily wage so far below the market price that the inevitable shortage of jury labor has to be supplied by coercion. We also just don't want professional jurors. The problem is very much the same as the military draft, where the army pays far below the market wage for privates, cannot obtain the number of men they want at that wage, and then turns to supply the gap. Let the courts pay the market wage for juries, and sufficient supply will be. If there can be no compulsion against jurors or witnesses, a libertarian legal order will have to eliminate the entire concept of the subpoena power. Witnesses, of course, may be requested to appear, but this voluntarism must also apply to the defendants. They have not yet been crime. In a libertarian society, the plaintiff would notify the defendant that the latter is being charged with a crime and that a trial of the defendant will be underway. The defendant would be simply invited to appear. There would be no compulsion on him. If he chose not to defend himself, the trial would proceed in absentia, which of course would mean that the defendant's chances would be by that much diminished. Yeah, that's a tricky spot. Tricky spot to be in. The same way, a defendant could not be kept in jail before conviction, unless, as in the case of police coercion, the jailer is prepared to face a kidnapping conviction if the defendant turns out to be innocent. Punishment and proportionality. We love punishment, and I guess proportionality is nice too. Proportionality. It's a word that's gonna kill me. This one's kind of banging. Two aspects of libertarian political theory are in a less satisfactory state than the theory of punishment. Usually, libertarians have been content to assert or develop the axiom that no one may aggress against the personal property of what sanctions may be taken against such an invader has been scarcely treated at all. We have advanced the view that the rights to the extent that he deprives another of his right. The theory of proportionality. We must now elaborate further what such a theory of proportionality implies. In the first place, it should be clear that the proportionate principle is a maximum rather than a mandatory punishment. In the libertarian society, there are, as we have said, only two parties to a dispute action: the victim or plaintiff, and the alleged criminal, defendant. It is the plaintiff that presses charges in the courts against the wrongdoer. In a libertarian world, there would be no crimes against an ill-defined society, and therefore no such person as a district attorney decides on a charge and presses those charges against the alleged criminal. The proportionality rule tells us how much punishment a plaintiff may exact from a wrongdoer, and no more. It imposes the maximum limit on punishment that may be inflicted, or the punisher himself becomes a criminal aggressor. Thus, it should be quite clear that under libertarian law, capital punishment would have to be confined strictly to the crime of murder. For a criminal would only lose his right to life if he had first deprived some victim of that same right. It would not be permissible then for a merchant whose bubblegum had been stolen to execute bubblegum. If he did so, then he, the merchant, would be an unjustifiable murderer. He could be brought to the bar of justice by the heirs or assigns of the bubblegum thief. But in libertarian law, there would be no compulsion on back to this maximum. If the plaintiff or his heir, for example, not believe in capital punishment, for whatever reason, he could voluntarily forgive the victim part or of his. If he were a Tolstoyan and was opposed to punishment altogether, he could simply forgive the criminal, and that would be that. Or, and this has a long and honorable tradition in the older Western law, the victim or his heir will allow the criminal to buy his way out of part or. Thus, if proportionality allowed the victim to send the criminal to jail for 10 years, if the victim wished, pay the victim to reduce or eliminate this. Proportionality theory only supplies the other. It tells us how much punishment a victim may rightfully. A problem might arise in the case of murder, since a victim's heirs might prove less than diligent and murderer will be unduly inclined to let the murderer buy his way out of punishment. This problem could be taken care of simply by people stating in their wills what punishment they should like to inflict on their possible believer in strict retribution as an opponent punishment could then have their wishes precisely carried. The deceased could provide in his will for, say, a crime insurance company, which he subscribes to be the prosecutor of his. If, then, proportionality sets the upper bound to punishment, how may we establish proportionality? First point is that the emphasis in punishment must be not on paying one's debt to society, whatever that may mean, but in paying one's debt to the victim. Clearly, the initial part of that debt is restitution. This works clearly in cases of theft. If A has stolen $15,000 from first or initial part of A's punishment must be to restore that $15,000 plus damage due to cost and suppose that, as in most cases, has already spent the money. In that case, proper libertarian punishment forces the thief to work and allocate the income to the victim until it has been repaid. The ideal situation, then, puts the criminal frankly into a state of enslavement, the criminal continuing in that condition of just slavery and rest the man he wronged. We must note that the emphasis of restitution punishment is a diametrically opposite current practice. What happens nowadays is the following absurdity. A steals $15,000. B, the government tracks down, tries, and convicts A, all at the expense of B as one of the new taxpayers victimized in the. Then the government, instead of forcing A to repay B, work at that debt is forces B, the victim, pay taxes to prison for where in the world is the justice here? The victim not only money, pays more money besides the dubious thrill of catching, convicting, and the criminal is still enslaved, not to the good purpose of recompensing the victim. The idea of primacy for restitution to the victim has great precedent in law. Indeed, it is an ancient principle that has been allowed to wither away. The state has aggrandized and monopolized the. In medieval Ireland, for example, a king was not the head of state, but rather a crime insurer. If someone committed a crime, the first thing that happened, the king paid the insurance benefit to the victim, and then proceeded to force the criminal to pay the king in turn. Restitution to the victim's insurance company being derived from the idea of restitution. In many parts of colonial America, too poor to afford the dubious luxury of prisons, the thief was indentured out by the courts there to be forced to work for his victims until debt was paid. This does not necessarily mean that prisons would disappear in the liberal society, but they would undoubtedly change drastically. Their major goal would be to force the criminal to provide restitution to their victim. In fact, in the Middle Ages generally, restitution to the victim was the dominant punishment. Only as the state grew more powerful, the governmental authorities approached ever more into the payment process. increasingly confiscating a greater proportion of the criminal's property themselves, and leaving less and less, unfortunately. Indeed, as the emphasis shifted from restitution to the victim, from compensation by the criminal to his victim, punishment for alleged crimes committed against the state, punishments exacted by the state became more and more severe. As the early 20th century criminologist William Tellock wrote, it was chiefly owing to the violent greed of feudal barons and ecclesiastical powers that the rights of the injured party were gradually and finally, to a large extent, appropriated by these authorities, who exacted a double vengeance, indeed, upon the offender, by forfeiting his property to themselves instead of to his victim, and then punishing him by the dungeon, the torture, stake, or the pit. But the original victim of wrong was practically ignored. Or, as Professor Schaefer has summed up, as the state monopolized the institution of punishment, so the rights of the injured were slowly separated from. But restitution, while the first consideration in punishment, can hardly serve as the sufficient criterion. One thing, if one man assaults another and there is no theft of property, there is obviously no way for the restitution. In ancient forms of law, there were often set schedules for monetary. The criminal would have to pay the victim so much money for an assault, so much more for mutilation, etc. But such schedules are clearly wholly arbitrary and bear no relation to the nature of the crime itself. We must therefore fall back upon the view that the criterion must be loss of rights by the criminal to the same extent as he. But how are we to gauge the nature of the extent? Let us return to the thief of $15,000. Even here, simple restitution of the $15,000 is scarcely sufficient to cover the crime, even if we add damages, costs, interest, etc. For one thing, mere loss of money stolen obviously fails to function as a deterrent to such crime, although we will know that deterrence itself is a criterion. If then we are to say that the criminal loses rights to the extent that he deprived the victim, we must say that the criminal should not only have to return the $15,000, that he must be pay the victim another $15,000, that he in turn loses those rights, $15,000, get taken from the victim. In the case of theft, then, we may say that the criminal must pay double the extent of theft, once for restitution of the amount stolen, and once again for loss of what he had deprived another. But we are still not finished with elaborating the extent of deprivation of rights involved in a crime. A had not simply stolen $50,000 can be restored and an equivalent penalty. He had also put B into a state of fear and uncertainty as to the extent that B's deprivation would go. The penalty levied on A is fixed and thus putting A in far better shape than so that for proportionate punishment to be levied, we would also have to add more than double, so as to compensate the victim in some way for the uncertain and fearful aspects of his position. What this extra compensation should be, possible to say exactly. That does not absolve any rational system of punishment, including the one that would apply in the living society, from the problem of working it out as best as one can. In the question of bodily assault, where rest does not even apply, we can again employ our criterion of proportion, so that if A has beaten up in a suit, then B has the right to beat A or have him beaten up by judicial, rather more than the same extent. Here, allowing the criminal to buy his way out of the punishment could indeed, but only as a volunteer with the plaintiff. For example, suppose that A has barely beaten. B now has the right to beat up A as severely or a bit more, or to hire someone, some organization to. In a libertarian society, could be marshals hired by privately fun. But A, of course, is free to try to buy his way out, AB giving his right to have his aggressor beaten up. The victim, then, has the right to exact punishment up to the proportional amount as determined by the extent of the crime. But he is also free either to allow the aggressor to buy his way out of punishment, or to forgive the aggressor partially or altogether. The proportionate level of punishment sets the right of the victim, upper bound of punishment. How much, whether the victim decides to exercise that right, is up to him. As Professor Armstrong puts it, there should be a proportion between the severity of the crime and the severity of the punishment. It sets an upper limit to punishment, just what is due. Justice gives the appropriate authority, in our view, the right to punish offenders up to some limit. One is not necessarily and obliged to punish up to the limit. Similarly, if I lend a man money, I have a right in justice back. But if I choose not to take it back, I have not done anything unjust. I cannot claim more than is owed to me. I am free to claim less, even to claim nothing. Or, as Professor McCloskey states, you do not act unjustly if moved by beneficence, impose less than is demanded by justice. But there is a grave injustice if the deserved punishment is exceeded. Many people, when confronted with a libertarian legal system, are concerned with this problem. Somebody be allowed to take the law into his own. The victim, or a friend of the victim, be allowed to exact justice personally. The answer is, of course, yes. All rights of punishment derive from the victim's right of self-defense. In the libertarian, purely free market society, however, the victim will generally find it. Yo, sup, Raymond? We're learning about beating up criminals. We're on the chapter about punishment. I think it's called Punishment and Proportionality. We'll get to the chapter. Yeah, punishment and proportionality. Tough word to say over and over. Where was I? In the libertarian, purely free market society, however, the victim will generally find it more convenient to entrust the task to the police. It's a bit. Hold up, I gotta Google Code of Hammurabi. It sounds familiar. Code of Hammurabi, is this? Go to Wikipedia. Eye for an eye, yep. Yeah, it's very similar to the eye for eye. Yeah, because I'm used to hearing eye for an eye in the context of the mosaic. Or the, all that stuff. Yeah. Although here they've established it's so you have a right to so there's restitution and then there's punishment. These are the two elements of justice that they outlined. You have a right of restitution proportional to the damages caused. And then you also have a similar right of punishment proportional to the amount they infringed upon your rights, which is a bit like in some contexts it's quite clear, but so you're essentially getting double back. And then you can also just have them pay you to not exercise the exact same kind of punishment. You can come up to, you either get to enact the same punishment, or you can enter into some agreement with them that they have to accept. You're not. When I say they have to accept, it means it's contingent on their acceptance, not that they are compelled to accept. I realize it's an ambiguity of the words. So you can enter into a the free contract, whatever. What's the term? Voluntary contract with them, for them to, enter some other contract. I also think the way it's being laid out, it's like, yeah, this is important, but in practice, more than likely, you're going to have some agency that handles these sorts of agreements. And it'll end up just being like, hey, what's the price of this? Not what's the price in principle, but like, hey, we'll just sort of have a price associated with it. Yeah, you'll have a third party. I don't want to be the one. Like if someone beats the brakes off of me, and then I might not be in a state to beat the brakes out of them in recompense, but. A third party. Or the third party might, but hey, we're gonna beat the brakes off of you. Or you can just pay us like a fat stack of cash. Yeah, just let the third party do it. Anyway. Suppose, for example, that Hatfield murders McCoy. Oh yeah, there's also there's probably gonna be a way murder's a funny one because the victim's not there anymore. But, I'm trying to think. It's explained earlier. You had to be it for it. But the other people, your the people around you are aggrieved by it. Your heirs, your relatives, your insurance agency. Generally, they talk about insurance agents. Yeah. Suppose, for example, that Hatfield murders McCoy. McCoy then decides to seek out next to Hatfield himself. This is fine. Wait. McCoy 2? What's going on here? Hatfield 1 murders McCoy 1. McCoy 2. Okay. The subscript. This is my first time seeing this in this. McCoy 2 then decides to seek out and execute Hatfield 1 himself. This is fine, except that, just as in the case of coercion, just in the previous section, McCoy 2 may have to face the prospect of being charged with murder in the private courts by Hatfield. point is that if the court find that Hatfield 1 was indeed the murderer, then nothing happens except public approbation for executing justice. But if it turns out that there was not enough evidence to convict Hatfield 1 for the original murder, or if indeed some other Hatfield, some stranger, committed the crime, then McCoy 2, as in the case of the invaders mentioned above, cannot plead. He then becomes a murderer, liable to be executed by the courts at the behest of irate Hatfield heirs. Hence, just as in the libertarian society, police will be mighty careful to avoid invasion of the rights of any suspect unless they are absolutely convinced of his guilt, willing to put their bodies on. So also few people will take the law into their own hands, unless they are similarly convinced. Furthermore, if Hatfield merely beat up McCoy 1, and then McCoy kills him in return, this too would put McCoy up for punishment as a murderer. Thus, the almost universal inclination would be to execution of justice, decision based on rules of evidence, trial procedure, etc., similar to what may apply now, would be accepted by society as honest and at the best that could be achieved. So note there, but it should be evident that our theory of proportional punishment, that people may be punished by losing their rights to the extent that they have invaded the rights of others, is frankly a retributive theory of punishment. A tooth or two teeth for a tooth. Retribution is in bad repute among philosophers who dismiss the concept. Another libertarian, Juan Ramon Rayo, I'm not sure what double L is in Portuguese, speaks about the forms of defense, punishment, and prosecution that could exist in a anarcho-capitalist society without police. But someone responded with something very true. It sounds like gangs or mafias carrying out street justice. Anyway, that's what we've got now, sort of. We already have gangs carrying out street justice. It's just what's the right way for those gangs to be organized. Well, mafias, I think the defining element of a mafia is the racketeering. I think if it doesn't have racketeering, it's not a mafia. That's not in the definition, but not in the definition. And the courts would not be at racketeer. They might be at liberty in the sense that, there could be a situation where no one can stop them. But they're not within their rights, racketeer. Under a libertarian theory of law. Under libertarianism. Anyway. Retribution is in bad repute among philosophers who generally dismiss the concept quickly as primitive or barbaric, and then race on to a discussion of two other major theories: deterrence and rehabilitation. But simply to dismiss a concept as barbaric can hardly suffice at all. After all, it is possible that in this case the barbarians hit on a concept that was superior to the more modern creeds. Professor H.L.A. Hart describes the crudest form of proportion, such as we have advocated here, lex talionis, as the notion that what the criminal has done should be done to him, and wherever thinking about punishment is primitive, as it often is, this crude idea reasserts the killer should be killed, violent assailant should be. But primitive is scarcely a valid criticism, and Hart himself admits this crude form presents fewer difficulties to find versions of proportionality to attribute to this thesis. His only reasoned criticism seems to think dismiss the issue. A quote from Blackstone: "There are very many crimes that will in no shape admit of these without manifest absurdity, and theft cannot be punished by theft, defamation by defamation, forgery by forgery, adultery by adultery. But these are scarcely cogent criticisms. Theft and forgery constitute robbery, and the robber can certainly be made to provide restitution damages. There is no conceptual problem there. Adultery, in the libertarian view, is not a crime at all, and neither, as will be seen below, is defamation. Let us then turn to two major modern theories, if they provide a criterion for punishment which truly meets our conceptions of justice as retribution does. Also, there is nothing wrong with meeting defamation with defamation. Defamation can definitely be met with defamation. You don't need a court to do that. You just say, hey, this guy's a fucking liar. You know? You don't... Like, okay, there's... You know, as with any legal system, there's always like, oh, the trouble of having the power to do it, which is, you know, not what this book's about. Not, that's not a libertarian model of power or something like that. The economics behind it. Power's complicated. Out of scope. Let us then turn to the two major modern theories and see if they provide a criterion for punishment which truly meets our conceptions of justice, as retribution does. Deterrence, an eye for an eye, rejected by philosophers. Last I checked, Plato, Aristotle, St. Thomas, Kant, basically the entire philosophical tradition were in favor of the death penalty. Yeah, I think it has modern philosophers. Where was the thing? Is in bad repute among philosophers, so I think he's talking about modern philosophy. As in, you know, a current context. But... You know what? Check something. I'm gonna check my other monitor. Catechism.
Discovery's 4 computers now have primary control of critical vehicle functions.
Checking out the catechism, but it's complicated, as with most things. Also, you know, the Catechism is saying, hey, don't seek out the death penalty. The Catechism is saying we should abolish the death penalty. Doesn't mean that the death penalty is wrong for non-Christians. I gotta say it. And there's always a words escape me. Deterrence was forth by utilitarianism. Not a big utilitarianism. As part of its aggressive dismissal of principles of justice and natural law, and the replacement of these allegedly metaphysical principles by hard practicality. The practical goal of punishments then supposed crime, either by the criminal himself or by other members of society. But this criterion of deterrence implies schemas of punishment which almost everyone would consider grossly unjust. For example, if there were no punishment for crime at all, a great number of petty theft. On the other hand, most people have a far greater built-in inner objection to themselves committing have the uplift and would be far less apt to grosser crime. Therefore, if the object of punishment is from crime, then a far greater punishment would be required for uplift than for prevention. A system that goes against most people's ethical standards. As a result, with the funny argument. As a result, with deterrence as the criterion, there would have to be stringent capital punishment for petty thieves, theft of bubblegum, while murderers might only incur the penalty of months in jail. Similarly, a classic critique of the deterrence principle is that if deterrence were our sole criterion, it would be perfectly proper police or courts to publicly crime someone whom they know to be innocent, but whom they had convinced the public was guilty. This is a more classic one. The knowing execution of an innocent man, provided of that the knowledge can be kept secret. There it is. There it is forgotten that the norm never eradicates the fault. I'm not sure what that quote means. I'm not sure what that sentence means. There it is forgotten that the norm never eradicates the fault. I can't quite pass that. Provided, of course, that the knowledge can be kept secret would just as fully as the execution. And yet, of course, who goes violently against almost everyone's standards of justice. In fact, that nearly everyone would consider such schemes of punishment grotesque, despite their fulfillment of the deterrence criterion, shows that people are interested in something important: deterrence. What this may be is indicated by the overriding objection to scales of punishment. The killing of an innocent man clearly invert our usual justice. Instead of the punishment fitting the crime, it is now graded in inverse proportion to its severity, or is meted out to the innocent rather than the guilty. In short, the deterrence principle implies a gross violation of the intuitive sense that justice is some form fitting to the guilty party and to him. Even if we say, if you do X, we Y you, and the punishment is hard, the people will Y no matter what. I mean, will do Y no matter what, or X no matter what? You're talking about the... X, okay, yeah. Sure. Not sure how well deterrence works on me. I don't know. I feel like I haven't been like operantly conditioned to not commit crime, and I don't pay attention to punishments ever. Yeah, people still murder. It might be rarer because of deterrence. I'm not sure. I've never been so inclined. Most recent, supposedly highly humanitarian criterion for punishment is rehabilitate the criminal. Old-fashioned justice, the argument goes, concentrated on punishing the criminal either in retribution or to deter future crime. The new criterion humanely attempts to reform and but on further consideration, humanitarian rehabilitation not only leads to arbitrary and gross injustice, it also places enormous and arbitrary power inside men's fates in the hands of the dispensers of. Thus, suppose that Smith is a mass murderer, while Jones stole some fruit from a stand. Instead of being sentenced in proportion to their crimes, their sentences are now indeterminate, with confinement ending upon supposedly successful rehabilitation. But this gives the power to determine the prisoners' lives in the hands of an arbitrary group of supposed rehabilitators. It would mean that instead of equality under the law, an elementary criterion of justice, with equal crimes being, one man may go to prison for a few if he is quickly rehabilitated, while another may remain in prison indefinitely. Thus, in our case of Smith and Jones, suppose that the mass murderer Smith is, according to our board of experts, rapidly rehabilitated, is released in 3 weeks, the plaudits of the supposedly successful reform. And meanwhile, Jones, the fruit stealer, persists in being incorrigible and clearly unrehabilitated, at least in the eyes of the expert board. According to the logic of the principle, he must stay incarcerated indefinitely, perhaps for the rest of his life, for while the crime was negligible, he continued to remain outside the humanitarian measure. Thus, Professor K.G. Armstrong writes of the reform principle. The logical pattern of penalties for each criminal given reformatory treatment sufficiently changed experts to certify him as reformed. On this theory, every sentence determined at the psychologist's pleasure. Perhaps there is no longer any basis, principle of a definite limit. Stole a loaf of bread, well, we'll have to reform if it takes the rest of life. From the moment he is guilty, the criminal loses his rights as a not a form of humanitarianism. Never has the tyranny and gross injustice of humanitarian theory of punishment revealed in more scintillating fashion than by C.S. Lewis. Let's go, C.S. Lewis mentioned. I still need to read Mere Christianity. Oh well. Noting that the reformers called their proposed actions healing or therapy rather than punishment. This adds, but do not let us be deceived by a name, taken without consent from my home and friends, use my liberty, undergo all those assaults on my person. Modern psychotherapy knows how to deliver. I know that this process will never end until either my captors have succeeded or I grown wise enough to achieve the apparent success. Who cares whether this is called punishment or not? That it includes elements for which punishment is dared, shame, exile, bondage, and years eaten by the locust. Only in the full desert. What does that mean? Ill desert. could justify it, but good. Ill desert? An archaic term. Oh, ill-deserved. Okay. Goodness. Ill-deserved. Okay. Only enormous ill-desert could justify it, but ill-desert is the very conception which the humanitarian theory has thrown over. Already been converted to the well hat site. What? I'm not sure what that means, Dreamy Bloody. This is like Murray Rothbard. He's like a normal. Lewis. Also, we're talking about like C.S. Lewis. He couldn't probably get more normal than it, but like not by much. The Anglican, I think. Lewis goes on to demonstrate the particularly harsh tyranny that is likely to be levied by humanitarians out to inflict their reforms and cures on the populace. Of all tyrannies, a tyranny exercised for the good of its victims may be the oppressor. It may be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep. His cupidity may at some point be satiated. But those who torment us for our own good, torment us without end, they do so with the approval of their own conscience. They may be more likely to go to heaven, yet at the same time likelier to make a hell of earth. This very kindness stings within. Be cured against one's will, and cured of states which we may not regard as disease, put on a level of those who have not yet reached the age of reason, those who never will. Be classed with infants, imbeciles, and domestic animals, but to be punished, however severely, because we have deserved it, because we ought to have known better, treated as a human person made in God's image. Furthermore, Lewis points out the rulers can use the concept of disease as a means for terming any action they dislike as crimes, and then to inflict a totalitarian rule therapy. For if crime and disease are to be regarded as the same thing, it follows that any state of mind which our masters disease can be treated as crime and compulsorily cured. It will be vain to plead that states of mind which government need not always involve moral turpitude, and do not therefore always deserve of liberty. For our masters will not be used concepts of desert and punishment, but those of disease and cure. It will not be even if the treatment is painful, even if it is lifelong, even if it is fatal, that will be only a regrettable accident. The intention was purely therapeutic. Even in ordinary medicine, there were painful operations and fatal operations. So in this. But because they are treatment, not punishment, they can be criticized only by fellow experts and on technical grounds, never by men as men, grounds of justice. Thus, we see that the fashionable reform approach to punishment can be at least as grotesque and far more uncertain and arbitrary as the deterrence principle. Retribution remains as our only just and viable theory of punishment and equal. crimes is fundamental to such retributive punishment. The barbaric turns out to be the just, modern and humanitarian turn out to be grotesque parodies of justice. Children and rights. Everything this guy said here in the chat is true. Raymond said? And he hasn't really been, like, critical of me. He made a reference to some Juan Ramon Rallo. But, like, yeah, sure. Oh, well, some guy disagreed with some other guy called, you know, some other libertarian. I don't know, Raymond hasn't been hitting me with, like, any hard criticism. It's been very conversational. Mostly... I don't know, most of the stuff felt like a yes and, or a, you know, like an insight. Maybe I've been misreading him, but, like, you know. If he has meant to disagree, it has been, like, very pointed. No, it's fine that anarcho-capitalism is kind of a meme. I blame the modal libertarians. And man, they are frustrating people. Although children rights, this is the part where it's likely to be like, maybe quiet down there, Murray Rothbard. This is the one where I'm likely to disagree with. I do think you, I do think there are implicit agreements between that can be known, and that not knowing sort of makes your theory fall apart. But we'll see what he has to say. I'm not here to agree with everything Rothbard says. It's gonna be quite a long chapter, though. Long and boring one, probably. We have now established each man's property right in his own person, virgin land, finds and transfers by his own land. And we have shown that from these two principles deduce the entire structure of property rights in all types of goods. These include the goods which he acquires in exchange or as a result of a voluntary There remains, however, the difficult case of children. Right of self-ownership by each man has been established for adults. Natural self-owners must use their mind to select and fulfill their ends. On the other hand, it is clear that a newborn babe is in no natural sense a self-owner, rather a potential self-owner. But this poses a difficult problem, for when or in what way a growing child acquire his natural right to liberty and self-ownership? Gradually, or all at once? What age? What criteria do we set forth for the shift or transition? First, let us begin with the prenatal child. What is the parent's or mother's property right in the fetus? In the first place, we must note that the conservative Catholic position has generally been dismissed too brusquely. This position holds that the fetus is a living person, true, and hence that abortion is an act of murder and must therefore be outlawed, as in the case of any. The usual reply is simply to demarcate birth as the beginning of a live human being possessing natural rights, including the right not to be murdered. Bad argument. before birth, the counter-argument runs, a child cannot be considered a living person. The Catholic replied that a fetus is alive and an imminently potential person, then comes disquietingly close to the general view that a newborn baby cannot be aggressed against because it is a potential adult. That's not really how I'd phrase it. This is the thing we're up. A fetus is a living human person. While birth is indeed the proper line of demarcation, the usual formulation makes birth an arbitrary dividing line and lacks sufficient rational groundwork in the theory of self-ownership. I think he takes something close to the like the violinist position. We'll see. I think the violinist argument's not great. Already like the proper groundwork for analysis of abortion is in every man's absolute right to self-ownership. This implies immediately that every woman has the absolute right to her own body. That she has absolute dominion over her body and everything. This includes the fetus. Most fetuses are in the mother's womb because the mother consents to this situation. So the fetus is there by the mother's freely granted consent. But should the mother decide that she does not want the fetus there any longer, the fetus becomes a parasitic invader of her person. Doesn't follow. And the mother has the perfect right to expel this invader from her domain. Doesn't follow. Abortion should be looked upon not as murder of a living person, but as the expulsion of an unwanted invader from the mother's body. Any laws restricting or prohibiting abortion are therefore invasions of the rights of. It has been objected that since the mother originally consented to conception, the mother has therefore contracted its status with the fetus and may not violate that contract by having an abortion. That would be a really bad counter-argument. Sure, that argument's bad. There are many problems with this doctrine, however. In the first place, as we shall see further below, a mere promise is not a contract. Contracts are only properly enforced if their violation involves implicit theft, and clearly no such consideration can be applied here. Secondly, there is obviously no contract here. Fetus, fertilized ovum, can hardly be considered a voluntarily and contracting entity. And thirdly, as we have seen above, a crucial point in libertarian theory is the inalienability of the will, and therefore the ability of enforcing voluntary slave contracts. Even if this had been a contract, then it could not be forced because a mother's will is inalienable, and she cannot legitimately be enslaved into carrying and having a baby again. Another argument of the anti-abortionists that the fetus is a living human being and is therefore entitled to all of the rights of human beings. Very good, let us concede for purposes of the discussion that human, or more broadly, potential human. That's not more broadly? I guess it is more broadly, but it's overbroad. You don't need to broaden it. Potential human beings won't have rights. And are therefore entitled to full human rights. But what humans, we may ask, have the right to be coercive parasites within the body of an unwilling human? There are situations in which you have a right to forms of parasitism on another person. Clearly. Like last chapter had a lot to do with this. there were situations in which, like the situation of, like the case with criminals, a person has a right to be parasitic off of their someone that perpetrated a crime against them in order to achieve retribution. Restitution, that's the clearly no born humans have such a right, and therefore a fortiori the fetus can have no such right either. Special pleading. What we are trying to establish here is not the morality of abortion, but its legality, i.e. the absolute right of mother. Yeah. The anti-abortionists generally couch the preceding argument in terms of a fetus, as well as the human's right to life. We have not used this concept in the volume because of ambiguity, and because any proper rights implied by its advocates are included of the right to self, right to have one's person free from aggression. Even Professor Judith Thompson, who in her discussion of the abortion attempts inconsistently to maintain the concept of right to life, along with the right to one's own body, lucidly demonstrates the pitfall and errors of the right to life doctrine. In some views, having a right to life includes having a right to be given at least the bare minimum one needs for consent. But suppose that what in fact is the bare minimum a man needs for life, something he has no right at all to be given. If I am sick unto death, and the only thing that will save my life is a touch of Henry Fonda's cool hand on my fevered brow, then all the same I have no right to be given a touch of Fonda's cool hand on my fevered. It would be rightfully nice of him to fly in from the West Coast to provide it, but I have no right at all against anybody that he should. In short, it is impermissible to interpret the term right to life to give one an enforceable claim to the action of someone else to sustain that life. In our terminology, such a claim would be an impermissible violation of the other person's right of self-ownership. Or, as Professor Thompson cogently puts it, having a right to life does not guarantee having either a right to be given the of or a right to be allowed continuation of another person's body, even if one needs it for life itself. Missing the condition under which the baby ends up in the mother's body. Suppose now that the baby has been born, then what? First, we may say the parents, or rather the mother, is the only certain and visible parent, as the creators of the baby become its own. I don't agree with this. A newborn baby cannot be an existent self-owner. Therefore, either the mother or some other party or parties may be the baby's owner. Assert that a third person will claim his own over the baby, give that person the right to see the baby by force from its natural or homesteading owner. Mother then is the natural and rightful owner of the baby, and he attempts the baby by force is an invasion of her property right. But surely the mother or parents may not receive the ownership of the child in absolute fee simple, because that would imply the bizarre state of affairs that a 50-year-old adult would be subject to the absolute unquestioned jurisdiction of the given to. So the parental property right must be limited to time. Also must be limited to kind, for it surely would be grotesque for a libertarian who believes the right of self-ownership advocate the right of a parent to murder or torture his or her children. I guess that's right. I think his understanding of, I think your self-ownership begins at conception. That's the obvious take. When you come into existence. We must therefore state that, even from birth, the parental ownership is not absolute, but of a trustee or guardianship, has always been. In short, every baby, as soon as it is born, and is therefore no longer contained within its mother's body, possesses the right of self-ownership by virtue of being a separate entity and a potential adult. It must therefore be illegal and a violation of the child's rights for a parent to aggress against his person by mutilating, torturing, murdering him, etc. On the other hand, the very concept of rights is a negative one, demarcating the areas of a person's action that no man may properly interfere with. No man can therefore have a right to compel someone to do a positive act. For, in that case, the compulsion violates the right of person or property of the individual being coerced. Thus, we may say that a man has a right to his property, i.e. a right not to have his property invaded. We cannot say that he has a right to a wage. That would mean that someone would be coerced into providing him with such a wage, and that would violate the property rights of the people. As a corollary, this means that in a free society, no man may be saddled with legal obligation to do anything for another that would invade the former's rights. You responsible for the consequences of your own actions. That's the simple way I have to say it. The only legal obligation one man has to respect the other man's right. Applying our theory to parents and children, this means that a parent does not have the right to aggress against his children, but also that the parent should not have a legal obligation to feed, clothe, and educate his children. Since such obligations would entail positive acts forced upon the parent and depriving the parent of it, the parent therefore may not murder or mutilate his child, and the law properly outlaws the parent from doing it. But the parent should have the legal right not to feed the child, i.e. to allow it to die. The law therefore may not properly compel the parent to feed a child or to live. Again, whether or not a parent has a moral rather than a legally enforced obligation to keep the child alive is a completely separate question. This rule allows us to solve such vexing questions as, should a parent have the right to allow a deformed baby to die even by not feeding it? The answer is of course yes, following A43 from the larger right to allow any baby with a deformed. Though, as we shall see below, in a libertarian society, the existence of a free baby market brings such neglect down to a minimum. Theory also enables us to examine the question of Dr. Kenneth Edelin of Boston City Hospital, convicted in 1975 of manslaughter for allowing a fetus, at the wish, of course, of the mother, after. If parents have the legal right to allow a baby to die, then a fortiori they have the same right for extrauterine. Similarly, in a future world where babies may be born in extrauterine devices, test tubes, again, the parents would have the legal right to pull the plug on the fetuses, rather, choose to pay to continue the plug in place. Let us examine the implications of the doctrine that parents should have a legally enforced obligation to their children. The argument for this obligation contains two components: that the parents created the child by a freely chosen, purposive act, and that the child is temporarily helpless, not a self-owner. I think parents do have a legally enforceable obligation. But, yeah. This is the way I approach the abortion case. If we consider first the argument from helplessness, and first we may make the general point that it is a philosophical fallacy to maintain that A's needs properly impose request obligations on B to satisfy these needs. For one thing, B's rights are then violated. Secondly, if a helpless child may be said to impose legal obligations on someone else, why specifically on parents? Well, parents are responsible from being in the situation where dependent on them. What do the parents have to do with it? The answer, of course, is that they are the creators of the child, but this brings us to the second argument from creation. Considering then the creation argument, me, hey, I'm here. This immediately rules out any obligation of a mother to keep a child alive who was the result of an act of rape. Yes. Since this was not a freely undertaken act, it also rules out any such obligation by a step-parent, foster parent, or guardian who didn't participate at all in creating the child. Furthermore, if creation engenders an obligation to maintain the child, why should it stop when the child becomes an adult? Because the child leaves a state where they are dependent on parents, their continued existence. The parents are still the creators of the child. Why aren't they obliged to support the child forever? True that the child is no longer helpless. Helplessness, as pointed out above, is not in and of itself a cause of binding obligation. Yeah, not the cause of the obligation, but it's a factor. If the condition of being the creator of another is the source of the obligation, terms aren't exactly how to talk about them. Source of the obligation, and this condition persists, why doesn't the obligation? Okay, this isn't exactly the terms. And what of the case in some future decade when a scientist becomes able to create human life in the laboratory? The scientist is then the creator. Must he also have a legal obligation to keep the child alive? Yes. Suppose the child is ill, scarcely human. Does he still have a binding legal obligation to maintain the child? Yeah. And if so, how much of his resources, time, energy, money, capital, equipment, should he be legally required to invest to keep the child alive? Where does his obligation stop, and by what criterion? The question of resources is also directly relevant to the case of natural answer the question. As Evers points out, let us consider the case of poor parents who have a child who gets sick. The sickness is grave enough that the parents, in order to maintain the medical care to keep the baby alive, have to starve themselves. Do the parents have an obligation to lessen the quality of their own life to the point of self-extinction to aid the child? And if not, I might add, at what point does the parent's legal obligation properly cease? By what criterion? One might want to argue that parents owe only the average care, health and nutrition, necessary to keep a child alive. But if one is going to take the obligation position, it seems illogical of the wide variety of human characteristics. High obligation, Procrustean bed of the human average. common argument holds that the voluntary act of the parents has created a contract by which the parents are obligated to maintain the child, but this would also entail this alleged contract with the fetus that would prohibit abortion. I mean, the same principle would cause the prohibition on. It's not a contract. This falls into difficulties with the contract theory as analyzed above. Finally, as Evers points out, suppose that we can the case of a person who voluntarily rescues a child from a flaming wreck that kills the child's parent. In a very real sense, the rescuer has brought life to the child. Does the rescuer then have a binding legal obligation to keep the child alive from then on? No. Wouldn't this be a monstrous involuntary servitude that is being rescuer? Yeah. And if for the rescuer, why not also for the natural parents? Because the mother then becomes, at the birth of her child, its trustee owner, legally obliged only not to aggress against the child's person. Since the child possesses the potential for self-ownership. Apart from that, so long as the child lives at home, it must necessarily come under the jurisdiction of the parents, property owned by those parents. Certainly, the parents have the right to set down rules for their home and property persons with their children at home. But when are we to say that this parental trustee jurisdiction over children shall come to an end? Surely any particular age, 21, 18, only be arbitrary. The clue to the solution of this thorny question lies in the parental property rights for the child has his full right of self-ownership when he demonstrates that he has them in short, when he runs away from home. Regardless of his age, we must grant to every child regardless of age. Now, if a parent may own his child, then he may also transfer that ownership to someone else. This is not the framework that I approached it. This is a difficult chapter because I just don't agree with this framework. This is where anarcho-capitalism is, because they don't have... When they reject the existence of obligations that come about by virtue of your actions. Like, when you aggress against someone, you owe them restitution. It's not just that they have a right to extract restitution from you, it is that you owe them restitution. Similarly, when you put someone into a situation where they are dependent on for their continued well-being, then you owe them that. He may give the child out for adoption, or he may sell the rights to the child in a book. In short, we must face the fact that the purely free society will have a flourishing free market and... Yeah, sure, you can sell this agreement. Superficially, this sounds monstrous, but closer thought will reveal the superior humanism of such a market. For we must realize that there is a market for children now, that since the government prohibits sale of children at price, the parents may now only give their children away to licensed adoption agencies, free of charge. This means that we now indeed have a child market. Government enforces a maximum price control and restricts the market to a few privileged and therefore monopolistic agencies. The result has been a typical market where the price of the commodity is held by government far below the free market price, an enormous shortage of the good. The demand for babies and children is far greater than the supply, and hence we see daily tragedies of adults denied the joys of adoption by prying and tyrannical adoption agents. In fact, we find a large unsatisfied demand by adults and couples for children, along with a large number of surplus babies neglected or maltreated by their parents. Allowing a free market in children with balance will allow for an allocation of babies and children away from parents who dislike or do not care for their children, and toward foster parents who desire such children. Everyone involved, natural parents, the children, and the foster parents purchasing them, would be better off in this sort of society. In the libertarian society, then, the mother would have the right to her own body and therefore perform an abortion, would have the trustee ownership of her children, ownership limited only by the illegality of aggressing against their persons and by their absolute right to run away or to leave home at any time. Parents would be able to sell their trustee rights in children to anyone who wants to buy them at any mutually agreed price. Present state of juvenile law in the United States, it might be pointed out, is in many ways nearly the reverse of our desired libertarian model. In the current situation, both the rights of parents and children are systematically violated by the state. First, the rights of the parents. In present law, children may be seized from their parents by outside adults, almost always the state, for a variety of reasons. Two reasons: physical abuse by the parent and voluntary abandonment are plausible, since the former case the parent aggressed against the child, and the latter the parent voluntarily abandoned custody. 2 points, however, should be mentioned. A. That until recent years the parents were rendered immune by court decisions from ordinary tort liability in physically aggressing against their children. Fortunately, this is now being remedied. And B, despite the publicity being given to the battered child syndrome, estimated that only 5% of child abuse cases involve physical aggression by the parent. On the other hand, the two other grounds for seizing children from their parents, both coming under the broad rubric of child neglect, clearly violate parental rights. These are failure to provide children with the proper food, shelter, medical care, or education, and failure to provide children with a fit environment. It should be clear that both categories, and especially the latter, are vague enough to provide an excuse for the state to seize almost anything. Up to the state to define what is proper and fit. Equally vague are other corollary standards allowing the state to seize children whose optimal development is not being promoted by the parent, or where the best interests of the child, again all defined by the state, thereby. A few recent cases will serve as examples of how broadly the seizure power has been exercised. In the 1950 case of Bree Watson, the state found a mother to have neglected 3 children by virtue of the fact that she was incapable by reason of emotional status, mental condition, and her allegedly religious feelings amounting to fanaticism. In its decision, fraught with totalitarian implications, the court stressed the alleged obligations of parents to bring up children respecting and adjusting to conventions and the phrase of they are to live. In 1954, in the case of Hunter v. Powers, the court again violated religious freedom as well as parental rights by seizing a child on the ground that the parent was devoted to a non-conformist religion. The child should properly have been studying rather than passing out religious literature. A year later, in the case of Henry Black, a Utah court seized 8 children from their parents because the parents had failed to teach children polygamy was immoral. Not only religion, but also personal morality has been dictated by the government. In 1962, 5 children were seized by the mother by a court on the ground that the mother frequently entertained male companions in the apartment. In other cases, courts have held parents to have neglected the child, and thereupon the child is parental quarreling, or a child's sense of insecurity allegedly endangered the child's best interest. In a recent decision, Justice Woodside of the Pennsylvania Superior Court trenchantly warned the massive coercive potential of the best interest criteria. A court should not take the custody of a child from their parents solely on the ground that the state of its agencies can find a better home. If the better home test were the only test, public welfare officials take children from half the parent state homes are considered less desirable and place them in the homes of the other half of the population to have desirable homes. Extending the principle further, we would find that the family believed to have the best home could have the choice of any of our children. Rights of children, even more than those of parents, have been systematically invaded by the state. Compulsory school attendance laws, endemic in the United States since the turn of the century, force children either into public schools or into private schools officially approved by the state. Supposedly humanitarian child labor laws have systematically forcibly prevented children from entering the law, thereby privileging their adult competitors. That's a fun. Yeah, I'm gonna post that one as well. Okay, so supposedly humanitarian child labor laws have systematically possibly prevented from entering the labor force, thereby privileging their adult competitors. Murray and Papa. This picture. Yep. The fun line though. Forcibly prevented from working and earning a living, and forced into schools which they often dislike or are not as suitable. Hey, the multi-chat doesn't show what those emotes look like, and I can't see them on my end. Hey, Smokey, how's it going? We're talking about child labor laws right now. Here was the very fun line. Supposedly humanitarian child labor laws have systematically forcibly prevented children from entering the labor force, thereby privileging their adult competitors. Yeah, I'm good. Got a sore leg. Not sure what's up with that, but like right in the muscle. The ham? Is ham the one on the front, or is that? Which one's quads and which one's hams? I think quads are the back. I think it's the ham. Knee pain? Oh, I've heard that knee surgery is tomorrow, so... Is that meme still funny? I don't think it is, but... Is it funny? Okay. Forcibly prevented from working and earning a living, and forced into schools which they often dislike or are not suited for, children often become truants, a charge used by the school to corral them into penal institutions. Reform. Quite tall? Ah, that'll do it. Where children are in effect imprisoned for actions or non-actions that would never be considered crimes if by adults. I mean, we're increasingly getting there. Yo, big man Francis!
Welcome home, Columbia. Beautiful, beautiful.
Which, I'm gonna assume that was on Kick, because actually I'm not sure. How's it going, big man Francis? Oh, it's on Twitch, never. I can look over there. Anyway. It has indeed been estimated that from 1/4 to 1/2 of juvenile delinquents currently incarcerated by the state did not commit acts that would be considered crimes if committed by adults, i.e. aggression against person and property. Crimes of these children were in exercising their freedom in ways disliked by the minions of the state, truancy, incorrigibility, running away. Between the sexes, it is particularly girl children who are jailed in this way for immoral rather than truly criminal action. The percentage of girls jailed for immorality, waywardness, sexual relations, rather than for genuine crimes, ranges from over 50 to over 80%. I don't like this angle. Since the US Supreme Court's decision in the 1967 case of Henry Galt, juvenile defendants, at least in theory, have been accorded the elementary rights of the right to notice of specific charges, the right to counsel, right to cross-examine witnesses, but these have only been granted in cases where they have actually been accused of being criminals. As Beatrice Levedar writes, Galt and similar decisions not apply to any adjudicatory hearings except those in which the offense charged to the juvenile would be violation of the criminal laws if committed by an adult. Therefore, the safeguards of Kent, Galt, and Winship do not protect the process rights of juveniles who are dependent, neglected, in need of supervision, truant, runaway, or accused of other offenses of which only juveniles can be guilty, such as smoking, drinking, staying out late, etc. Staying out late as an offense? That's like a thing normal people do. As a result, juveniles are habitually deprived of such elemental procedural rights accorded to adult defendants as the right to bail, the right to a transcript, the right to appeal, the right to a jury trial, burden of proof to be on the prosecution, and the inadmissibility of hearsay evidence. As Roscoe Pound has written, powers of the Star Chamber were trifle in comparison with those of our juvenile court. Once in a while, a dissenting judge has leveled a trenchant critique of the system. Thus, Judge Michael Musmano stated in a 1954 Pennsylvania case, certain constitutional and legal guarantees, such as immunity against self-incrimination, prohibition of hearsay, interdiction of ex parte and secret report, also jealously upheld in decisions from Alabama to Wyoming, are to be jettisoned in Pennsylvania. A person at the bar of justice is a tender-aged boy or girl. Furthermore, the state juvenile codes are studded with vague language that permits almost unlimited trial and incarceration for various forms of immorality, habitual truancy, habitual disobedience, incorrigibility, ungovernability, moral depravity, in danger of becoming morally depraved, immoral conduct, and even associating with persons of immoral character. he's kind of cooking here, but it's also a, Moreover, the tyranny of indeterminate sentence, see our chapter above on punishment, has been wielded against juveniles, with juveniles often receiving a longer sentence than adult would have suffered for the same offense. Indeed, the rule in contemporary juvenile justice has been to impose a sentence that may leave a juvenile in jail until he reaches the age of majority. Furthermore, in some states, in recent years, this evil has been compounded by separating juvenile offenders into two categories: genuine criminals, who are called delinquents, and other immoral children, who are called persons in need of supervision, pins, after which the pins offenders may receive longer sentences than the actual juvenile criminals. Thus, in a recent study, Paul Lerman writes, the range of institutional stay was 2 to 28 months for delinquents and 4 to 48 months for pins boys. Median was 9 months for delinquents and 13 months for pins. And the average length of stay was 10.7 months for delinquents. The results of length of stay do not include detention stage of correctional processing prior to placement. Analyses of recent detention figures for all 5 boroughs of New York City revealed the following patterns. 1. Pins boys and girls are more likely to be detained than delinquents, 31%. 2. Once Pins youth are detained, they are twice as likely to be detained for more than 30 days than are regular delinquents, 50 to 25%. Again, it is mainly female juveniles punished for immoral offenses. A recent study of Hawaii, for example, found that girls charged merely with running away normally spend 2 weeks in pre-trial detention, whereas boys charged with actual crimes are held for only a few days, and that nearly 70% of the imprisoned girls in a state training school were incarcerated for immorality offenses, whereas the same was true of only 13% for the imprisoned boy. The current judicial view, which regards the child as having virtually no rights, was trenchantly analyzed by Supreme Court Justice Abe Fortas' decision in the Galt case. The idea of crime and punishment was to be abandoned. The child was to be treated and rehabilitated, and the procedures from apprehension through institutionalization were to be clinical rather than. These results were to be achieved without coming to conceptual grief by insisting that the proceedings were not adversary, but that the state was proceeding as parens patriae, state as parents. The Latin phrase proved to be a great help to those who sought to rationalize the exclusion of juveniles from the constitutional scheme, but its meaning is murky and its historical credentials is relevant. The right of the state as parens patriae to deny the child procedural rights available to his elders, elaborated by the assertion that a child, unlike an adult, right not to liberty but to custody. If his parents default in effectively performing their custodial functions, that is, if the child is delinquent, the state may interfere. The child has a right to. It's complicated. Right, a little bit, The state may interfere. In doing so, it does not deprive the child of any rights because he has none. It merely provides the custody to which the child is entitled. On this basis, proceedings involving juveniles were described as civil, not criminal, and therefore not subject to requirements which restrict the state and seeks to deprive a person of his life. It may be added that calling an action civil or custody does not make incarceration isn't or any less incarceration, treatment, or the rehabilitation. Criminologist Frederick Howlett has trenchantly criticized the juvenile court system and placed it in a wider libertarian context. Rights of denial of certain basic rights of individuals, right to associate with those of their choice and to engage voluntarily in acts that hurt themselves. The drunk who clogs our courts have the right to get drunk. A prostitute and her client should not have to answer to the law for an act that is their personal decision. A behaving child likewise has a fundamental right to be a child, and if he has committed no act that would be criminal, were he an adult, why seek recourse through the court? Before rushing to treat or help a person outside the justice system, should not the community first consider the alternative of doing nothing? Should it not recognize a child's right as a person to non-treatment and non-interference by an outside authority? A particularly eloquent judicial defense of the rights of children occurred in an 1870 Illinois decision, years earlier than the modern assertion of state despotism. The juvenile courts, beginning with the turn-of-the-century progressive decision in Ex Rel. Connell v. Justice Thornton declared of the absorption of the child in and its complete subjection to despotism of the state is wholly inadmissible in the modern civilized world. These laws provide for the safekeeping of the child. They direct his commitment and only a ticket of leave of the uncontrolled discretion of a board of guardians permit the imprisoned boy to breathe the pure air of heaven outside his and to feel the instincts of manhood by contact with the busy world. Confinement may be from 1 to 15 years, according to the age of the child. Executive clemency cannot open the prison doors. No offense has been committed. The writ of habeas corpus, a writ for the security of liberty, can afford no relief. The sovereign power of the state, as parens patriae, has determined the imprisonment beyond recall. Such a restraint upon natural liberty is tyranny and oppression. If, without crime, without the conviction of any offense, children of the state are thus to be confined for the good of society, and society had better be free government acknowledged failure. The disability of minors does not make slaves or criminals of them. Can we hold children responsible for crime, liable for their tort, impose onerous burdens upon them, and yet deprive them of their liberty without charge or crime? The Illinois Bill of Rights, following upon Virginia Declaration of Rights and the Declaration says that all men are by nature free and independent, certain inherent and inalienable rights. Among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit. This language is not restrictive. It is broad and comprehensive. There's a grand truth that all men, all people everywhere, have the inherent and inalienable right to liberty. Shall we say to the children of the state, you shall not enjoy this right, right in of all human laws and regulations. Even criminals cannot be convicted and imprisoned without due process of law. And that's it for today, I think. That's children and rights. And I disagree with him on his pro-choice. I think it's not very well rooted in where it has a bad conception of where a person becomes a person. Anyway, I was expecting something stronger. I was expecting a stronger pro-choice argument, but it's just none of it was my objection. If it makes sense. Anyway, that's gonna be it for tonight. I've read a fair bit, but I need to get back in habit of streaming, but reading is not the way to do it because Very exhausting. Yowie zowie, am I right? Anyway. Is it worth rating? A look. I don't think so.